So this is Ephesians chapter 5, the scripture for February 6th. And in this part of the letter, as with many of his letters, Paul warns about some things. He exhorts believers to stay away from certain things. And in this particular case, Paul warns about the attractions of idolatry and sexual immorality. And then he goes on to define these in a rather unique way. With sexual immorality, he includes any and all speech that is obscene, that's silly, and that's vulgar. For idolatry, he talks about greed. And both of these sort of redefinitions are really worth looking at here. So as Christians, I think that we can sometimes consider vulgar or silly or obscene speech as okay, because we don't want to be seen as being like serious all the time. I get that. We shouldn't be serious all the time. There are things that we should laugh at, and we should have a sense of humor that includes ourselves. If we don't do that, we're lost. We can't take ourselves that seriously. However, we don't have time to be flippant about things. That shouldn't be in our DNA either. Instead of being flippant, but also instead of taking things too seriously, we need to look for ways to give thanks for what God has given us. We need to look at ways to build one another up instead of always bringing other people's minds into the gutter. That's not something that we should be known for. Now, being greedy for something involves valuing it immensely, giving it perhaps an undue amount of worth. Worship is a word that comes from the act of giving something a lot of worth. We worship God because God is of immense worth. God is of ultimate worth. But if we're greedy for something, that involves valuing it at a higher worth than it ought to be given. So being greedy for something inevitably is going to involve worship of something other than God. Worship of something other than God is idolatry. And that's why Paul identifies idolatry with greed. Our words, our actions, our desires, all of these things matter to God. So stay away from obscene, vulgar, or silly speech. Stay away from idolatry. With Christ's coming, God's light of truth and grace entered into the world. So as Christians, then, we must act as if this light matters to us. It has to change our behavior, how we live and what we do, including how we party or celebrate. This is why Paul says that drinking to excess isn't something that we're about. It's greedy and therefore idolatrous. And therefore, it shouldn't be a regular practice for the children of light. Verses 21 through 33 of this chapter they've generated a lot of discussion, I think, in Christian circles, particularly in light of their instructions to men and to women who are married. There have been a ton of opinions, thoughts, and papers about this in the church, and if you want to look into it, you just type in men and women or submission in the church, and you'll find a ton of stuff written. Particularly in Western culture, I think the idea of submission, whether submitting to someone or something, feels fraught. It feels dangerous. And yet, if Christians are going to demonstrate unity, submission isn't an optional thing. It's something necessary. It's required practice. That's why the beginning of this section in 21 through 33 begins, submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. Any other comments on this passage about women submitting to men or husbands loving their wives has to be read in light of mutual submission and understanding of one another. These last verses in Ephesians 5 are part of something called a household code. This was something that would find its way into many letters at the time. Many rhetorical papers included a household code, and Paul's no exception here. Household codes rarely gave women any authority in the home. And that's part of what sets this particular household code that Paul puts together. It's part of what sets that apart. You see, in this particular household code, husbands are charged to offer self-sacrificing love for wives. That would have been a stunning demand at the time that this was written. For husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, this is something that just was not common practice and was something that husbands would read and their jaws would fall on the floor. There's also been, I think, a bunch written about the difference in instructions Paul gives here to husbands and to wives. And I think that it's important to note that there are differences, generally speaking, between men and women, even if there are a ton of things that are the same between men and women. We're all created in God's image, no matter what your gender. But it's important to note that, generally speaking, men and women have different wants or different needs at different times. And so it's important, Paul thinks, to have this sort of blanket understanding that perhaps in your marriage, your operating systems are going to look a little different. And that's okay. You shouldn't want your operating systems to look the same. However, Paul is not the expert on your marriage if you happen to be married. If you happen to be married, you and your spouse are probably the experts on your marriage. And so Paul's guidelines here ought to offer a good base value, a good base starting point. But then you and your spouse need to figure out specifically, how do you feel loved? How do you feel respected? And how do you feel cherished within the contours of your marriage? As Paul says elsewhere, they too have the Spirit of God. That's all for Ephesians chapter 5. Tomorrow, February 7th, we'll read Ephesians chapter 6 and conclude Paul's letter to the Ephesians. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.